It is an honor to be with you today, particularly because I can express my support and solidarity and be by your side right after the UN Committee on Human Rights has condemned Ireland for its abortion law, considered cruel, inhuman, degrading, and discriminatory, as if abortion wasn't the cruelest, most inhuman, most degrading and discriminatory activity ever. It's always happened when I come here to give some talks. There is some attack on Ireland, or there is something going on. The first time I came was at the time of the Lisbon Treaty, to try to fight against the approval of the Lisbon Treaty. Then later on, many other events, and last year I came to help in the campaign against the so-called marriage equality. So it's always for me a pleasure and an honor to be with you and by you, helping in this fight against these terrible international forces that are attacking Christianity and Ireland as still a stronghold of Christianity in this de-Christianized Europe. So it's really a great pleasure for me. The talk today will be around Fatima, because obviously next year is the centenary of Fatima. But you notice I didn't put the centenary of Fatima, but the century of Fatima, which is different. We're not just celebrating the fact that next year will be 100 years since the apparitions of Our Lady Fatima, but basically the whole century is marked by Fatima. That is basically what I will demonstrate. So the very first thing, someone may ask, well, what's the importance of the century of? For human psychology is really very important. Centuries and centenaries are indeed relevant. So let's start with this quote from Cicero. Historia vero testis temporum, lux veritatis, vita memoriae, magistra vitae. History is the true witness of the times, is the light of truth, is the memory of life, and the teacher of life. Magistra vitae. History is magistra vitae. Now, in order for us to, some people say that history is a cruel teacher, because it only teaches afterwards, when we already committed the mistake and we cannot withdraw. And also some people say, well, it's a teacher, but we not always take the lesson of this teacher, because the men are the only animals who put the foot twice in the same hole. All other animals avoid it. Anyway, but history is important for us, for our construction, or mental construction. So the first thing is we need chronology of things. This is, you all have experience with children. When there is a quarrel among children, one of the child comes and and it's a very chaotic account of events. So the first thing the mother has to do is, well, calm down and tell me now what happened first, and then the sequence of events, in order to understand what really happened and where the responsibilities are. Well, that is because, and some people are very shocked with an event also is the same. You have to calm down, well, let me know, because chronology, either is chronology or chaos in our minds. So precisely, chronology is the science of locating historical events in time, and works like a mental scaffolding for organizing historical thought. around patterns of historical duration, of patterns of historical succession. So, since humanity is on this earth, we have tried to keep chronology of events to try to understand the meaning of these events. The primitive framework was basically just give record what happened during the such and such pharaoh or king. So we kept record in this way. In Greece was curious, the victorious athletes in the Olympic Games. So that will be like in Ireland to keep the historical events according to the different winners in hurling. So we said this happened after so and so won the matches, etc. In Rome, at the beginning, it was two consuls who held office that year. So they say, well, when these two consuls were in office, then happened this and that. But one Spanish fellow, called Orosius, he was Iberian, not Hispanic, Spain that didn't exist at the time. He really created the first systematic framework. And what he did is to fix the date of the founding of Rome. That's what is called ab orbe condita, at the time when Rome was built. And from then, he took all the records and put, well, this year, make all the accounts and make the line, the historical chronology. But for us Christians, the most important was monk Dionysius Exiguus. Exiguus means the short, a very short monk from Bulgaria, who lived in Rome. And he was the one who made the first real chronology of the antiquity and then until his time, dividing history starting from the year when our Lord was born, from the incarnation. This is very important for us because fixes the incarnation of our Lord in the very center of history. So even today, someone who is an atheist has to recognize that we are in the year 2016, after the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ. This honor is given to him. Actually, it seems that Dionysius Exiguus committed a slight mistake, and in reality, we should be in the year 2020. We'll be 2020, but that is a small mistake. We pardon him for that. But that organized, and then from then, men were able to reflect on history and divide history then in periods. So to have a kind of elementary division of cycles of years. The Hindu, they started with 60 years, the Aztecs were 52 years because of that, and the Romans calculated with centurions, 100 years. Century come from centuria. They were very logical and mathematicians, the Romans, so they organized in this way. And since then, the idea of a century becomes very relevant for mankind. And the idea of an age, of historical period, an era having a distinctive feature, characterizing this. So let's say, for instance, in Greece, you have these Dark Ages, then on the Dark Ages, after the war in Troy, where almost civilization disappeared and all writing, etc. Then Archaic Age, where they started rebuilding the Greek culture, and so you have in the first potteries and that time. Then the Classical Age, the age of Pericles, the 5th century before Christ, and then the Hellenistic Age, when Greek culture spread in all the Mediterranean portal. So this is a way, because in each one of these ages you have a distinctive feature. Then you can start reflecting what really happened. And later they consider, one interesting thing here is that you see when civilization advances and gets out a kind of lethargy and accelerates. So you see the first period takes more or less 450 years, then the other one is 250, the other is 100 and something. they shortened. No? So naturally developed into the idea of century of. No? So for instance, you have in the 14th century, the century of the Black Death. That was the main element around which everything evolved, the religious, cultural, sociological, economic situation, because of the Black Death. No? I mean, almost 40% of the population was killed by this disease. No? Then the 15th century obviously is the Renaissance, no? Particularly the part in Italy, spread later on in the rest of Europe. Then the 16th century, the century of discoveries. No? In the 17th century, you can say, well, from the cultural viewpoint, the century of Baroque, or from the political viewpoint, is the century of Louis XIV, Louis the Great. At least the French, they organized history around their kings, obviously. The 18th century, everybody agrees, is the century of enlightenment. Then you have the 19th century, the century of the bourgeoisie, or of capitalism, or liberalism, industrialization, more or less is the same idea, or the century of nations. The first time they developed. One interesting thing is that when you see the century of something, it doesn't start at the very beginning of the century and the turning of the century, or end up at the turning of the century. For instance, the discoveries. In reality, the Portuguese turned the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, so before the century started. And I think the first Dutch explorer arrived in Indonesia, and then you can more or less put like the end of these discoveries also in 1590 something, before the end of the century. Or if you say the century of the Enlightenment, no? In reality ended up in 1789 with the French Revolution, so quite before the end of the century. And the century of the bourgeoisie started at that moment, and in reality ended only with World War I. Everybody agrees that basically the 19th century, the culture of the 19th century, the social setup of the 19th century, and finished with World War I, particularly this aspect of nationalism, no, that had grown so much. No. So the same thing we could say about the 20th century. The 20th century in reality started in 1917, or 1918 if you will. No? So after World War I. No? And because of that, we can say in reality the 20th century is the century of communism. The main event that marked the whole century and marked not only the political and economic and social events, but people's minds, no? People's subconscious is all linked with the spreading of communism. That is the reality. If you see, already, well, we started with the October Revolution in 1917, the killing of the Tsar and his family, and the first massacres, etc., marked very much. People were really horrified with this revolution. No? Then the 20s, the dictatorship of the proletariat, of Lenin's dictatorship established, and then shortly after started the collectivization of agriculture and the killing of the kulaks. The kulaks were these peasants, more rich peasants, and they were all killed. Or then, a little later, they massacred all the peasants also in the Ukraine. And also in the 20s, the one area that was particularly in the focus of people's attention was Mexico. Mexico was the first country to have really a socialist constitution after the URSS, and also the first Soviet embassy was in Mexico, and the President Calles was elected in a coalition with the Communist Party, and he started immediately persecuting the church and started the Cristero uprising, no, against this really communist regime. And this also marked very much all the minds of the people in that decade. In the 30s, the Comintern, I mean the international communists, started this policy of making popular fronts in every country, no, and trying to arrange coalitions, etc. But also started the Spanish Civil War. This really marked very much because of the cruelty that were committed at the time. And also the pact between Ribbentrop-Molotov, the Nazis, and the communists. Some years ago there was this film, Soviet History, showing how all the similarities between the Nazi regime and the communist regime. And even the Nazi, somehow it's a kind of mirror, because they pretended to be the reaction against communism. In reality it was a false reaction favored by the communists themselves. So we can say World War II at the core is basically the problem of communism. Then World War II, obviously, but then Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe, and when Churchill immediately after the war said, well, now we are in a horrible situation because an iron curtain was built now in Europe. Then the Chinese Revolution in 1948, and the beginning of the Cold War with the atomic threat. Basically, that was after the war, the main problem in diplomatic and everything was the threat of the atomic bomb. And so the kind of race between the United States mainly and Russia for the atomic bomb. And in the 50s was already the Korean War and the Hungarian Revolution, all these events that marked the culture very much, and Fidel Castro took power, and still is there, but it's a democracy, a popular democracy. And obviously started the revolutions in Latin America. Then we have the 60s, you were all still not born at that time, but if you were, or your parents told you, was basically around the Vietnam War. Everything was around the Vietnam War and Mao's Cultural Revolution with killings of millions of people, and then the Prague Spring and the Sorbonne Revolution in '68. These were definitely the events that marked most the spirit at the time. Then we have in the 70s the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia. Well, basically first the fall of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia into communism, and the Khmer Rouge genocide where they killed 2 million people, half of the population. And in Latin America we had communists taking power in my country, in Chile, or in Nicaragua, the Contra warfare and all that, and also Angola and Mozambique. And in the 80s, well, basically Ronald Reagan took power in the United States. I started Star Wars and said, well, we'll confront the Russian military power, and basically this forced Russia to quickly try to catch up military and was collapsed economically. So basically forced Gorbachev to start the Glasnost and Perestroika, and ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So you see, during the whole of the century, taking the century starting after World War I, dominated by this idea of the expansion of communism. And indeed, probably was the largest empire ever in the history of the world. We speak about Alexander's empire, or Roman Empire, or the British Empire. No empire in the world ever had that extension, dominating so many millions of people, and committing awful massacres that were recorded in this Black Book of Communism, Crimes, Terror and Repression, made by the very serious scholars, saying that 100 million people fell victims to communism around the world. Only because of that, we already noticed that communism is the most important event of the 20th century. and also is the century of the martyrs because of that. In no century how so many people died and suffered persecution precisely at the hands of communists, and for a portion of them at the hands of the Nazis. So I think you will agree with me that indeed the 20th century was the century of communism. But the 20th century had not finished yet, because communists had not finished yet. Here you see the religious persecution included in this communist revolution. There you see, I don't know if you notice, these fellows are burying our Lord Jesus Christ. They're putting in the hole and breaking the bell of the church, because religion has to be destroyed, because obviously progress. You can imagine how progressivist was Russia. And this ended up in all these massacres, millions of Christians. So in 1990, some people say, well, but communists ended up in 1990 because there was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then in the Eastern Bloc recovered the independence, and they became capitalists, and China started the open door policy a little before, but the first fruit started to appear at that period. So, well, communism is over. That is an illusion, total illusion, because Marxism is a mutant virus. These viruses that when you organize the body, they start a reaction, the virus mutates to try to infect you anyway. So communists in reality conquer the world in two ways. One, by violence, brutal military revolutions, brutal military invasion, concentration camps, government terror, etc. In the East, Russia, China, Eastern Europe, etc. In Latin America and in Africa, more or less, was in this way. But the other way was through an insidious cultural and moral subversion. And this was mainly made here, in the West. And in fact, communism is victorious in this area now, in our own country. Which are the difference between this classical violent Marxism and cultural Marxism? Classical Marxists tried to change society through collective ownership. They took power and said, well, we will create, everything will be collective, and then the new man will come out of this change of the structure. Cultural Marxism is the opposite. It's changing man himself by reinventing the family, the schools, everything, sex identity, and human nature. And so, once you change man, society will change by itself. The new man will build the new communist society. So that is basically the difference. But they have a philosophical and religious common ground, because the doctrinal difference between classical and cultural Marxists are less important. Both are materialistic, they are atheist, they are evolutionist, everything evolves, so they are relativists. That is the philosophical background of both. And they share a same hatred for God's order of the universe and the same will to destroy that order. That is the common ground of both. So basically is the kind of renewal in our times of the cry of revolt of Lucifer, non-serviam. I will not serve God, I will not respect the order that God put in the universe. So for instance, let's see Karl Marx's views on marriage. There is so much discussion about marriage in our country. Last year you approved marriage equality, between quotes. The revolution has not overthrown all tyrannies, because the evils of despotic power continue to exist in the family. So the father is a tyrant. So we have to become feminists. The abolition of the family is self-evident. The abolition of the family is self-evident. And that means the abolition of marriage. So this is Karl Marx, the founder of communism. The abolition of marriage. Marriage equality in reality is the abolition of marriage. The first draft of the Communist Manifesto. Communist society will transform the relations between the sexes into a purely private matter. That is marriage equality. It's a private matter, which concerns only the persons involved and into which society has no occasion to intervene. It's just to solemnize that these two people love each other, and want to live together for a while. So the first stage of cultural Marxism was as a byproduct of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So we had that no-fault divorce was enacted for the first time in the Soviet Union in 1918. I think in America, that probably was the first country, maybe the UK, was only in the 60s that no-fault divorce was enacted. Sex education for school children, a problem that we are having everywhere. Now the French government is trying to control free schools so that to make sure that children are properly educated with no sectarian ideologies. That means sex education, basically, what they want. Sex education for school children was first introduced in 1919 in Hungary by Georg Lukács during the Bela Kun's Bolshevik government that lasted only 1 or 2 years. But that was the very first sex education program in the world.
Was that communism?
Was communist regime, yes. That lasted very little. Abortion was decriminalized for the first time by Lenin in 1920. So what the UN wants Ireland to do, which have free abortion, basically, is a Leninist policy. So they are the new Lenins imposing a totalitarian, anti-Christian, anti-God society on us. Homosexuality was first decriminalized in the Soviet Union in 1922. In the West, it was in the 70s. So they are really the forerunners of all the changes our society is having today. So we can say the 20th century has not finished yet, and we are still under the communist regime. The only thing is a different form of communism. It's not the totalitarian political regime, but it's the cultural totalitarian regime that we are freely adopting now, the communist ideologies. So do you remember I mentioned Georg Lukács? It's this fellow here. He was leader in the Minister of Education of the Bela Kun government in Hungary, and the one who imposed sex education was graphically, they wanted even to have practical practices of sex in the schools. So radical were they. Well, this fellow, the government didn't last, so he had to escape from Hungary and went to live in Germany. And in Germany, with others, he created this Institute of Social Research at the Frankfurt University in 1923, and was modeled after the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow, officially. But was different form of Marxism being taught in Frankfurt than in Moscow, because it mixed Marxism with Freudian psychoanalysis. So introducing sex into this Marxist ideology. So there you have Sigmund Freud, Wilhelm Reich, and Herbert Marcuse. I will give you some of their ideas. In 1933, the members of this Frankfurt school, because a lot of them were Jews, fled to the United States and were hired at Columbia University, Princeton, and California, Berkeley, etc. So the Ivy League of universities in America started spreading this cultural Marxism from their classes. So, for instance, Wilhelm Reich, he is a disciple of Sigmund Freud. He started as a psychoanalyst. He held town rallies in Austria to promote the political virtues of infantile masturbation and pubertal sex. Very radical, because this was in the 20s already. In 1929, he organized the Socialist Society for Sexual Advice and Sexual Research. You see the mixture of Marxist and Freud. But was too radical for the time, so he was even expelled from the Communist Party for promoting this. In 1933, he was expelled from the German, because he had emigrated to Germany, and also was expelled from the International Psychoanalytic Association. But then he moved to America. But which were his ideas? The neurosis is the result of a conflict between instinctual demands, sexual appetites basically, and opposing social demands. So they had the fidelity in marriage, create neurotic people. That's basically virginity before marriage creates neurotic people. So in order to free people from neurosis, we have to end with marriage and with virginity, etc. So Dr. Reich wants to see the complete liberation of the child and adolescent sexuality from the oppression of the authoritarian family, of the church, and of the school. Well, it's precisely what our neighbors here in the meeting, the Labour Party, who are having their meeting there, they are promoting. It's precisely that. They take away the oppression of the authoritarian family, of the church, and of the school. So these are Wilhelm Reich's ideas in the 30s already. This cultural Marxism. He wants to see the adult freed from compulsive marriage. So this is for you. Those of you who are married, that this was compulsory. Society imposed on you to be married. And compulsive morality. Morality shouldn't be something from you learn at the catechism or your family. Values that you create yourself. It's the autonomy of values. You create your own values. He wants a return to what? To instinctual life. So we will be like animals, because precisely what differentiates men from animals is that the animals guide themselves by the instinct. They are not free because of that, but we are free. So they want to reduce us into animals. So this is an article, Sexuality and Freedom, in 1945, when Wilhelm Reich had just arrived in America and was started to spread his ideology. In America, he reprinted a soft version of his books, The Sexual Revolution and Mass Psychology of Fascism. As to make it, because he had been expelled from even from the Communist Party in Germany, so he said, well, I will give a more moderate version of it. And then, obviously, the virus mutated, penetrated very much in the academy, in the media, in society in general, even in the churches, unfortunately.
And did people not know what he was expelled from?
Maybe they knew, but they considered that once he had arrived in America, he had converted to liberal values. So, the second one, Herbert Marcuse. He emigrated to America, and then in 1955 he published Eros and Civilization, founding document of the 60s counterculture. The hippies were based on Marcuse's ideology. So he said that liberating the erotic side of man in rebellion against technological rationality would liberate people from the ills of modern industrial society. So imagination takes power. From this came this May 68 revolution in France, and one of their slogans was, "We will hang the last sociologist with the interiors of the last economist," because nothing should be rational. Everything has to be instinctual. And then imagination will take power. But the main slogan of this Sorbonne Revolution, you know what is this slogan? No? In French is "Il est interdit d'interdire." It's forbidden to forbid. It's forbidden to forbid. So, anarchy, total anarchy. No one can interdict anything to anybody. Yes. So, in the family, you can imagine in the family if this was applied. It is forbidden to forbid. No? Or in the schools, or in the streets, no? Everywhere. But that was their idea. No? So, he also is the father of the women's liberation movement. He was the one who said that this movement was to be the most radical and effective component of the revolution. And from there comes the feminist authors. No. So you take this very nice looking nanny, no? Even before Amoris Laetitia, you will give her communion without asking her, hearing her in confession, with no need of any form of follow-up and discernment. No? So nice she looks. Well, now look, she is actually professor of philosophy and professor of women and gender studies at the University of Colorado. Alison Jagger. Look what she says. The end of the biological family will also eliminate the need for sexual repression. So, family is conditioning our liberation of our sexual instincts. Male homosexuality, lesbianism, and extramarital sexual intercourse will no longer be viewed just as alternative options. Because alternative means there is a mainstream and then you have an alternative. No, it's common. It's totally common thing. Only that humanity could finally revert to its natural, polymorphously perverse sexuality. Actually, this is Freudian idea. No? Freud was the very first to say that the sexual instinct in man is perverse. And we should go back to our natural, perverse, polymorphous sexuality. And everything else is a repression. So, this is a bomb, all this. Sorry? It takes any form. So, male and women, children and adults, whatever you want. No? Bestiality, even bestiality. So, it is a Marxist revolution indeed, even though those who are promoting it are people like, let's say, Ndakeni, who says that he is anti-communist, because probably he defends private property, I don't know. But what he is promoting is in reality cultural Marxism. And this is part of communism. It is really a revolution, and a Marxist revolution. Another fellow, Charles Reich, writes the following: there is a revolution coming. It will not be like revolutions of the past. It will originate with the individual, not with the society, taking power and changing society. No, with the individual and the culture. And it will change the political structure as its final act. So, it's precisely the other way around. The new man will change the new society, opposite to what Lenin did. So, it's sad to say, but we are still in the middle of this revolution. And unfortunately, they have dominated totally the media, the universities, the political parties, everywhere. Even they have penetrated in the church.
The legal class.
The legal class, yes, exactly. The judges, yeah. Today, most of the decisions are not even taken by the parliament, are taken straight by the courts. And in the name of what? Human rights. So it's a conception of human rights totally cut from God and evolving. So anytime appears new aspirations, well, it's a human right. So soon you will see, soon pedophilia will be considered once again a sexual option because of that. So these are the heroes of Russia that Our Lady mentioned in her message. These are the heroes of Russia. There is continuity from Marx and Engels to Lenin, who imposed for the first time free divorce, abortion, homosexuality, etc. Then from Lenin to the Frankfurt School, and then the Frankfurt School and the universities in America and everywhere, abortion and LGBT lobby today, gender ideology, etc. It's straight line. So even though those who are promoting this, they don't label themselves communists, these are Marxist ideas. Now, classical communism was defeated in most countries in 1989, but its mutated virus, cultural Marxism, is now spread out and victorious all over the world. That is the reality. It won't be surprising if at one moment it shifts back to violent methods. And you see, this condemnation of Ireland by the UN is very significant, because precisely means that today you cannot be different of what they decide. And a country or a person who opposes must be eliminated. Last week, Cardinal Cañizares of Valencia in Spain made a statement against the LGBT lobby, and now he is being prosecuted for incitation to discrimination and all kinds of things, because it's a real dictatorship. You remember Cardinal George, before dying, he was already very sick of cancer. Before dying, he had a conversation with Obama about Obamacare, and then went back and had a meeting with his seminarians at the seminary. They asked him about the thing, and he commented with his seminarians, "I will die in bed," because he had cancer. "My successor will die in jail, but his successor will be beheaded in the public square." And then he said, "But the fourth one will pick up all the remnants and rebuild a Christian society." And that is true. So in reality, this would lead to the worst religious persecution in history, because they don't admit any form of opposition. You see that, for instance, how they are working to finish with a conscientious objection. So forcing doctors and nurses to perform abortions, or forcing civil servants to marry homosexuals. And if you don't, at the beginning will be jail, but afterwards probably will end up even worse. So, if what I'm saying makes sense, it corresponds exactly to what Our Lady prophesied in the apparition of July 13, 1917, and said to Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, "If my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted, and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world." There we are. The errors are spread everywhere, and even by people who pretend to be opposed to Russia, to communism, causing wars and persecutions of the church. The good will be martyred. That's why I insisted in this virus will mutate once again. The Holy Father will have much to suffer, various nations will be annihilated. And they are being annihilated already. First by demography. We don't have children anymore. And because we don't have children, we have to import immigrants. Most of them are from different cultures and different religion, and because of multiculturalism, we have to respect multiculturalism, so our Christian identity is feminine. So, in that sense, Catholic France doesn't exist anymore. Not at all. So, does it exist, France? A friend of the 19th century who go back to France now and say, no, this is not France. So, in that sense, already have been annihilated, but maybe will be annihilated even in a more serious way. No? That is what we will discuss in the next part of the talk. No? But I was told to divide into two, no? So as to have first a question period, because sometimes I am Latin American, so as a Latin I speak a lot. No? And you know, Fidel Castro used to have 8 hours long speeches, you know, and Chavez also, and Maduro trying to catch up, but the Venezuelans are not paying attention anymore. You know? So my tendency is to speak too long. But anyway, this time I try to be short, so precisely to take questions from you, and after we finish with the question, we can go for the rally, the Rosary Rally, precisely to ask Our Lady help on this battle, as you say. As human efforts fail to solve Ireland's or Europe or the world's problems, key problems, we turn to God through His Holy Mother, asking His urgent help. So, with that, I ended this first part of the presentation.